decades. I will say it's disappointing on the part of Charles, Paul, that it's taken the king this long.
King Charles has reportedly opened the palace file that could change Camilla's royal role. And what is so striking about that is not just the paperwork, not just the whisper of a private review, and not even the idea of a fresh palace decision. The real issue is what that kind of move reveals about the monarchy when it starts quietly reorganizing itself from the inside. Because when a king looks again at the role of the woman standing beside him, you are not looking at admin, you are looking at power, image, loyalty, succession, and the very careful question of who is meant to matter most as the crown moves into its next chapter. And that is why this feels bigger than it first sounds. If you follow royal drama closely, then stay with me on this one, because the surface story is only half the story, and the deeper meaning here says a lot about where Camilla stands, where Charles is heading, and what the palace may already be preparing for behind those carefully controlled doors. Because here is the thing, a palace file is never just a file. In royal life, paper can be more dangerous than confrontation. A conversation can be denied, a feeling can be softened, a public smile can smooth over almost anything. But once something goes into the machinery of the palace, once it becomes part of review, structure, duty, schedule, priority, and presentation, then it stops being gossip and starts becoming direction. That is what makes this so revealing. It suggests that Camilla's position is not simply being lived out day by day as the natural role of a king's wife. It suggests that her place is still being shaped, managed, defined, and perhaps narrowed or strengthened, depending on what Charles now believes the monarchy needs. And that is where this gets interesting. Because on the surface, people hear a line like this and imagine scandal. They imagine a furious private scene, a dramatic stripping away, a personal rejection. But that may not be the real picture at all. In royal terms, a role can change without any shouting. It can change through appearances, through patronages, through precedence, through access, through which duties expand and which quietly disappear, through who hosts, who speaks, who travels, who represents, and who simply remains present without being central. That is how monarchy works when it wants to shift something without turning it into a public crisis. So if Charles has opened a palace file that affects Camilla's role, then the deeper question is not whether he suddenly turned against her. The deeper question is what kind of monarchy he now thinks he must protect, and whether Camilla fits into that future in the same way she fit into the past. That is a very different question. And to understand why that matters, you have to understand who Camilla is inside this royal story. Factually, she is the queen. She is the wife of the monarch, the senior woman beside the sovereign, and a public figure who stands inside the ceremonial heart of the institution. But symbolically, Camilla represents something much more fragile and much more complicated. She represents a woman who was not born into the bloodline, not introduced as a fairy tale answer, not embraced in one easy sweep of public affection, but brought to the center through time, endurance, and the palace's long bet that steadiness could one day quiet resistance. Camilla was never the glittering beginning. She was the difficult continuation. That is why every change around her carries extra meaning, because her rise was not simple. It was managed, patiently, carefully, sometimes painfully. For years, the palace had to soften public feeling around her. For years, her value to the monarchy came through constancy rather than romance in the public imagination. She was framed not as the dream, but as the companion who stayed, the woman who knew Charles best, the figure who helped steady a man long defined by emotional strain, personal history, and the heavy shadow of what came before. In that sense, Camilla's role was always dual. She was both a wife and a solution, both a person and an institutional adjustment. And solutions get reviewed. That may sound cold, but the monarchy is cold in exactly that way. It has affection, yes. It has loyalties, yes. But it also has memory, strategy, priorities, optics. It never stops asking what each figure means to the whole machine. And that is why the idea of Charles opening a file feels so loaded. Because it suggests a moment when the private bond and the public function meet the hard edge of institutional reality. Now let's step back and look at Charles himself, because this story makes less sense if you treat him like an ordinary husband making an ordinary decision. He is not. Charles is the monarch. Factually, he is the head of the institution. Symbolically, he is the bridge between one royal era and the next, the man carrying the old language of duty into a far less forgiving age. He has spent his life preparing to inherit, then finally inherited at a time when the monarchy faces pressure from every direction: relevance, cost, generational expectation, media intensity, family fracture, and the constant comparison between image and purpose. Charles does not just think in emotional terms, he thinks in legacy terms. That is what makes this land harder than it looks. Because if he is reviewing Camilla's role now, then it may not be about personal feeling at all. It may be about the future shape of the crown. It may be about how much room there is for her at the symbolic center as the monarchy gradually leans toward William and Catherine as its future-facing image. It may be about whether Charles wants his reign defined by partnership or by streamlining. It may be about what has to be protected, what has to be simplified, and what has to look disciplined in a time when royal excess is judged fast and hard. And once you start looking at it that way, the file becomes much more than a file. It becomes a signal. A signal that the palace may be asking one of its oldest questions all over again. Who is central to the institution, and who is central only because of the person they stand beside? In ordinary life, that distinction can seem rude. In monarchy, it is basic architecture. Bloodline sits in one category. Marriage sits in another. Service matters. Popularity matters. Reliability matters. But birth, inheritance, and succession still carry a weight the institution never fully lets go of. Camilla has always lived inside that truth. That does not make her powerless. Far from it. She has influence, presence, rank, and years of hard-earned authority. But her authority has always been relational. It rises through Charles. It exists through her place beside the king. And that means the exact shape of her role can be adjusted in ways that a born royal's central identity usually cannot. That is not a moral judgment. It is simply how monarchy protects its inner core. And that is where the emotional tension begins. Because Camilla did not just drift into this role. She paid for it in public discomfort, in years of suspicion, in the slow labor of being tolerated before being accepted. She had to become useful. She had to become steady. She had to become the woman who did not challenge the institution, but absorbed its demands and kept moving. That gave her a clear narrative role inside the royal family, the quietly central companion, the seasoned loyalist, the outsider who earned proximity through endurance rather than innocence. But even that kind of earning has limits. Here is where people often miss the real story. The public likes to imagine that once a title is granted, the battle is over. Queen is queen. End of discussion. But that is not how royal life actually works. Titles solve one problem. They do not solve atmosphere. They do not solve instinct. They do not solve the inner choreography of who receives automatic deference, who is protected by the system without asking, and who still has to be managed carefully because their place, however elevated, carries political memory. Camilla still carries political memory, and Charles knows it. That is why any review of her role would matter so much. Not because it means disaster, but because it means her place remains an active question in how the palace presents itself. If Charles opens a file and looks again at how Camilla is positioned, then he is doing more than considering her diary or duties. He is considering what she symbolizes in the late shape of his reign. He is considering whether her visibility helps or complicates the institution's next phase. He is considering whether the monarchy looks stronger when she is front and center, or stronger when she is quieter, steadier, more carefully framed. That is not romance. That is monarchy. And it gets even more layered when you bring in the future of the family. Because no story about Charles and Camilla exists in isolation now. Everything is read through the question of succession. Everything is measured against what comes next. William, factually the Prince of Wales and heir to the throne, represents more than the next king. He represents the future image of the institution, the line moving forward, the bloodline made visible. Symbolically, he is the monarchy's long-term investment in continuity. Catherine beside him plays another role altogether. She is not born royal either, but she has been cast very differently in the national imagination. She represents polish, discipline, elegance, maternal stability, and a modern visual language the palace knows the public understands instantly. That contrast matters. Because when people look at Camilla, they do not see the future. They see settlement. They see the present king's chosen companion. They see a woman whose importance is tied to Charles's emotional and personal world. When people look at William and Catherine, they see projection. They see tomorrow. They see where the institution believes its most lasting symbolic energy may eventually rest. So if Charles is changing Camilla's role, even subtly, then there is every chance it is connected to that shift in gravity. Not a dramatic exile, not a humiliation, something more royal than that, a recalibration, a tidying of lines. A quiet acceptance that as the monarchy moves forward, some figures become more strategically central, while others become more ceremonial, more selective, more contained. And that is exactly the kind of change that can hurt without looking cruel. Because in this family, almost nothing is said plainly. A role shrinks by an inch, then another inch, then a season passes, then a set of appearances changes, then a pattern settles, and only later do people realize that the center of gravity has moved. That is how royal power shifts when it wants to remain dignified. It does not always slam doors. Sometimes it simply changes where the light falls. And if the light is shifting away from Camilla in any sense, then yes, that matters. It matters because she has spent years helping Charles construct a life that could survive public memory. She has been his listener, his buffer, his familiar shelter in a system that can be brutally formal. She has also been part of the palace argument that time can soften almost anything. That loyalty, repetition, duty, and sheer staying power can rebuild a public role that once looked almost impossible. So if Charles now opens the file and starts redefining that role, there is something emotionally sharp about it, even if he believes he is acting for the good of the crown. That is what makes this so layered. Because from one angle, Charles may be protecting Camilla. He may be reducing pressure, simplifying expectations, shielding her from overexposure, and preventing the monarchy from leaning too heavily on a figure whose public history is still more delicate than the palace likes to admit. He may be saying, in effect, that her role has already done what it needed to do, and that the next phase of the reign requires something more restrained and more strategically controlled. But from another angle, the same move can look like limitation. It can look like a reminder that even at the top, Camilla's role is not self-defining. It can look like proof that she remains important, but not unmovable. It can look like Charles acknowledging, however quietly, that there are boundaries around how far her symbolic reach should extend. And for a woman who has climbed that far through patience and discipline, that distinction would not feel minor. That would sting. Not necessarily because she wants spotlight for its own sake, but because every change in royal life carries meaning about value. If your role is adjusted, the natural question is why. If your profile is controlled, the natural question is what the palace fears. If your duties are refined, the natural question is whether this is support or sidelining. And in the royal family, the answer is often both. A person can be protected and reduced at the same time. Honored and contained at the same time, loved privately and limited institutionally at the same time. That contradiction sits right at the heart of Camilla's story, and it is why so many people would immediately sense tension in this kind of palace move. Not because they expect open conflict, but because they understand the emotional grammar of monarchy. They know that private affection does not cancel public calculation. They know that a king may care deeply for the woman beside him and still decide the institution needs to draw cleaner lines around her. They know that in royal life, intimacy does not always win against structure. If anything, structure usually wins. Look at Anne for a moment, because she offers a useful contrast. Princess Anne, factually the king's sister, represents the stoic worker, the royal whose usefulness is so established that she does not need decorative myths around her. Her place comes from bloodline and service together. She does not need to be carefully reinvented for acceptance. She simply exists within the monarchy's natural logic. Camilla's place, by contrast, has always depended more on framing, on timing, on public patience, on how the palace narrates her. That means her position is more exposed to revision. And once that truth is visible, the story stops being about one file and becomes about the old divide. The monarchy never fully escapes. The divide between those who are of the institution and those who are attached to it. Camilla is deeply inside the system now, but she entered it through attachment, not inheritance. That difference can stay quiet for years. Then one internal review, one shift in emphasis, one palace decision can bring it back into focus. That is where the atmosphere changes. Because what people often call royal drama is really royal sorting. The institution is always sorting roles, sorting relevance, sorting exposure, sorting meaning. Who stands where? Who travels when? Who speaks on what? Who is seen as essential to the sovereign's project, and who is seen as supportive but secondary? These choices are not random. They build the public map of the family. And if Charles is redrawing Camilla's map, then he is also telling us something about how he sees the reign itself. Maybe he wants a leaner monarchy. Maybe he wants fewer overlapping symbols. Maybe he wants to preserve Camilla's dignity by narrowing her burden. Maybe he wants the public story of the crown to look less domestic and more constitutional. Maybe he is already thinking ahead to a time when attention should rest more clearly on the heir and the next generation. Maybe he believes that too much focus on Camilla invites old arguments he no longer wants near the institution. Any of those readings would be plausible, and that is exactly why the move feels so loaded. Because none of them are really about paperwork. They are about legitimacy and narrative. They are about how the monarchy wants to be understood. Charles has always been a man of ideas, sometimes too much so, but one thing he understands better than most is symbolism. He knows that monarchy survives by turning private lives into public meaning. He also knows that not every symbol ages the same way. Some symbols become stronger over time. Others need gentler handling. Camilla may be both. She may be indispensable to Charles and still complicated to the institution. She may be emotionally central and strategically sensitive. She may be deeply respected inside the private world of the king while still being presented to the public in a way that never fully forgets the risks around her image. If that is true, then opening the palace file is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of royal management, cold, careful, and telling. But let's not pretend that management feels neutral to the person being managed. Because if Camilla becomes aware that her role is being reset, she will know exactly what that means. She will know it means the monarchy is once again deciding how much of her it wants visible. She will know it means her work, her loyalty, and her settled place beside Charles do not automatically protect her from institutional redesign. She will know that being queen does not free you from being measured. In some ways, it may trap you inside measurement even more tightly. That is where this stops being administrative and becomes emotional. Because no matter how disciplined the palace is, these are still human beings inside the machine. Camilla is not just a symbol. She is a woman who spent years living through public judgment and palace caution. Charles is not just the king. He is a husband whose personal life has always collided with constitutional expectation. So if this file really signals change, then somewhere underneath the formal language, there is likely discomfort, calculation, maybe even quiet sadness. Not melodrama, something more royal than that. A realization, a compromise, the acceptance that love and role are not the same thing. And that is perhaps the deepest truth this story exposes. The monarchy can raise someone high, dress them in dignity, and place them beside the sovereign, but it never fully stops deciding what that person is for. That is the brutal elegance of the institution. It turns people into functions. If the function changes, the role changes. If the role changes, the atmosphere around that person changes too. And once the atmosphere changes, everyone feels it, even when nobody says it out loud. So when people hear that Charles has opened the palace file that changes Camilla's royal role, what they are really reacting to is not only curiosity, it is recognition. Recognition that this family never gets to be only a family. Recognition that every private bond is filtered through hierarchy. Recognition that even the queen can find herself redefined if the crown believes the moment demands it. And maybe that is what makes this so compelling. It is not loud. It is not explosive in the usual way, but it is deeply revealing. It hints that Charles may already be shaping the final tone of his reign, deciding what must stay close, what must stay useful, and what must stay carefully contained so the institution can keep moving without reopening old wounds. If Camilla's role is changing, then the message may be simple but powerful. The monarchy appreciates loyalty, but it protects legacy first. That is a hard truth in any family. It is an even harder truth in this one. Because once legacy takes the lead, everyone else has to find their place around it. Some rise, some wait. Some are honored, some are softened. Some are moved slightly away from the center, so the future can come into sharper view. And often, the shift is subtle enough that the public only notices when a title, an appearance, a duty, or a pattern suddenly feels different. By then, the decision has already been made. And that is why this story may linger well beyond the headline. Because whether the palace calls it review, refinement, support, or strategy, what people will feel underneath it is the old royal question all over again. Who truly belongs at the center when the monarchy starts thinking not about emotion, but about survival? Camilla may still stand beside Charles. She may still carry status, dignity, and influence. But if the file has been opened, then something is being measured. Something is being arranged. Something is being quietly decided about how her role fits into the larger picture. And once that process begins, the effects rarely stay small for long. So what do you think this really means? Is Charles simply protecting the monarchy by reshaping Camilla's duties, or is this the clearest sign yet that her place, however elevated, has always been more conditional than it appeared? Let me know in the comments, because in royal life, the quiet decisions usually reveal the loudest truths.